thinking more directly about the Boxers themselves, there is actually another element of something we've discussed before we need to revisit, and this is the nature of Qing Chinese governance. So as you recall, in the Qing Dynasty as well as in the Ming Dynasty, there was a remarkably small number of centrally appointed officials at the local level, especially when we consider how immense and populous the empire was. So remember that ratio of one county magistrate to 200,000 subjects. So in order to govern, the state had to rely heavily upon local non-state actors, whether local notables or wealthy merchants or wealthy clans, who, what have you, in order to undertake business that in the kind of contemporary world we would associate with the nation state. So, the building of schools, the dredging of canals that have silted up, emergency granaries, the collection of taxes, among a variety of other factors. Now, as I noted in an earlier video, when this system worked, it worked really well. When those non-state actors, that band between the fingertips of the state and then local society, when it was working on behalf of the central power, it was kind of system reinforcing, then this system worked very well. Taxes were collected, things were kept out of law courts, they were kept off of the magistrate's desk, things were mediated locally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When this large band of activity, however, was populated by figures we would call anti-systemic, who were either at odds with the interests of the central court or, quite literally, rebelling against central authority, then things could go very badly very quickly. And here, of course, we had our earlier example of the mid-19th century rebellions, among them the Taiping Rebellion being the most devastating. Well, secret societies of this nature have a long history in Shandong province, which was in essence the cradle of the Boxer uprising. And what is more, new secret societies were emerging in this condition of late 19th century crisis and late 19th century encounters with an increasingly ferocious European and Japanese colonial, imperial framework. Two of these societies were important in particular: the Big Sword Society and the Spirit Boxers. The first of these was active in southwest Shandong, the Big Sword Society, and this was a well-organized and sort of highly managed secret society whose membership was kept quite kind of under control, and local elites played a very direct role in the management of this secret society. In contrast, the Spirit Boxers were involved a much wider set of practitioners. One could be inducted into this secret society very quickly through various rituals, and this contributed to its much more rapid spread. This was, in a certain sense, more acephalous, that is, kind of diffuse or anarchic, as compared to the Big Sword Society. And the Spirit Boxers, at its core, looked out upon the world around them and saw a world in crisis, thrown completely out of equilibrium. And the conclusion that many of these followers came to is that the cause of this disequilibrium, this crisis, was this foreign incursion into the empire, into Qing China. And so their answer to the crisis of equilibrium, both on a larger scale and on a personal scale, was something like a return to native values. And so something that was practiced by this group were forms of meditation and martial arts that were meant to foster qi, foster vital energy, to bring the body back into equilibrium, and that their practices were understood as having all of these various benefits to health and longevity. The other part of their program became an increasing aggression towards foreigners, notably Christian missionaries, and then the majority of these being Chinese converts to Christianity. We need to remember that the main targets of Boxer violence, and those who lost their lives in the greatest numbers were not white people and white Christians, they were Chinese converts to Christianity. So as this movement grew, peasant unrest took the form increasingly of physical attacks on foreign churches, Chinese missionaries, Christian missionaries, and their Chinese converts. And a slogan began to take shape, which referred to supporting the Qing and exterminating the foreigners, Fu Qing Mie Yang. So anti-foreignism was growing as a core element of this movement. Followers of this movement fell into even deeper crisis in the fall of 1898. In that year, the Yellow River broke its banks and flooded countless villages across the western part of the province. In terms of scale, the only thing that any viewer probably has in their mind which is comparable would be Hurricane Katrina. That was the scale of devastation that this natural disaster took in 1898. But we need to remember that the interpretation of natural disasters within the framework of kind of late imperial China, and actually even earlier in Chinese history, was that natural disasters was an indication of heaven's displeasure with the disequilibrium that had been allowed to fester in the world of men. And that in essence, when earthquakes happen, when droughts happen, when floods happen, this is an indication of heaven's displeasure. And in fact, according to sort of orthodox concepts of political legitimacy in China, in fact, this is a sign that rebellion against the current condition might not just be justified, but in fact called for by heaven itself. If this weren't enough, this area of Shandong province where the Yellow River had broken its banks and where people were encountering more and more these increasingly aggressive and brazen foreign missionaries and merchants and others, that Shandong was also bore arguably the heaviest burden for paying off the cost of the failed Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. Remember, the Treaty of Shimonoseki exacted an immense war indemnity that needed to be paid off. Well, the way in which it had to be paid off was through the raising of taxes at a higher level. And so everyday peasants, everyday farmers in this region found their tax burdens increased at precisely the same moment that they were facing really widespread ecological disaster in many parts of the province. Now, the Boxers received their first semi-official endorsement by the Qing state towards the close of 1899 and the beginning of 1900. Remember, they're undertaking aggressive and increasingly aggressive acts of violence against foreigners and against Chinese converts to Christianity. And so the Qing state is in this very bizarre position. I mean, if this rebel group had exuded even a whiff of being anti-Manchu or anti-Qing or wanting to overthrow the court in Beijing, then they would be just as threatening as any other rebellion that one could imagine, and that would require a violent and rapid suppression of this Boxer movement. But the Boxers weren't anti-Manchu. They were talking about supporting the Qing, and the enemies of the Boxers were in many ways the enemies of the Qing. That is, these increasingly aggressive European, Japanese, American merchants and diplomats and Christian missionary outfits. And so the Qing state had this ambivalence towards the Boxers at the end of 1899 and the beginning of 1900. Well, at this pivotal moment, in essence, the Boxers received something of a green light when the local governor of Shandong, a Manchu leader named Yu Xian, in effect kind of permitted, if not endorsed, their attacks on foreigners. Well, at the urging of foreigners who were growing increasingly worried about this growing Boxer threat, they basically forced the Qing government to remove Yu Xian from the post, from his governorship in Shandong, and to replace him. But Yuxian was not reprimanded with any severity by the Qing state. Instead, he was very quickly reappointed as the governor of another province, a very important province, of Shanxi in March of 1900. So he wasn't punished. Now, replacing Yuxian was a man we will come to know very well, a man named Yuan Shikai, and he carried out a campaign to suppress the Boxers, but more accurately, to get them out of his province of Shandong, and he really kind of pushed them out into the neighboring province of Zhili, which is now known as, or an area now known as Hebei province, which at that time was basically the home of Beijing. And that is one of the reasons why the Boxers will become so active in the area of Beijing, is not only because that's where so many foreign legations are, but also because they've been pushed out of Shandong province into Zhili, Hebei province by Yuan Shikai, who's trying to clean up his own province. So you get a sense of the ambivalence here. Some in Beijing even recommended that the Qing court effectively recognized the Boxers as something like an official state militia, not unlike the Qing had done many times in the recent past, first with the authorization or recognition of the Tuanlian, and then more importantly, with the authorization and formalization of the regional armies who effectively won the war against the Taiping. So if the Boxers were an efficacious and patriotic military, why shouldn't the Qing state incorporate them as a regular part of its forces? Well, some did not agree with this idea, Yuan Shikai being one of them. There was something about this movement that concerned him and a number of other regional leaders. Well, it was in this context of ambivalence that the Boxers became more brazen in their attacks. In May 1900, the Boxers set out to destroy telegraph lines, railway lines, all in an effort to isolate and cut off these foreign enclaves from their home countries and also from each other. And as part of this return to native values, there was a feeling among Boxers that all of this laying of railway and laying of telegraph line was damaging the feng shui of the empire. It was, in essence, doing violence to the energy of Earth and itself, and that this stuff needed to be uprooted and destroyed, and that a return to Chinese, if that word had been used, it wasn't, but of Chinese values instead. At court, soon the question couldn't be avoided any longer. What was the Qing going to do? Were they going to authorize the full-scale suppression of the Boxers and just crush them? Or were they going to endorse them and throw their weight behind them? The Empress Dowager Cixi was uncertain, Ronglu was uncertain, but there was at least one high official, the Grand Counselor Kang Yi, who advocated full-scale support. And ultimately, this was the direction that they went. On June 7th, a pivotal day in this conflict, Qing officials met with Boxer leaders in a village about 80 miles south of Beijing, and there, in effect, a kind of pact was made. Official imperial troops would give the Boxers freedom of movement, which translated in the freedom to attack foreigners and their Christian converts. On June 13th, the Boxers entered the Qing capital of Beijing, and what ensued was a widespread massacre of Christians and of Chinese converts to Christianity. In response, foreigners seized hold of the strategic Dagu forts in preparation for a counterattack. In response to that, Cixi ordered the Zongli Yamen, this kind of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Qing China, to sever all relations with foreign powers and to order the expulsion of foreign representatives from the capital and from China by force. On June 21st, Cixi and the Qing court effectively declared war on all Western powers who had any interests in China. News of this declaration came as a shock to regional Chinese leaders. These leaders, so Zhang Zhidong in the provinces of Hunan and Hubei, Liu Kunyi in the provinces of the lower Yangtze River, Li Hongzhang, who was then viceroy of Guangdong and Guangxi provinces, and Yuan Shikai, who was still governor general of Shandong, were nowhere near as sanguine as Beijing and the court about the wisdom or the likelihood of success of such a brazen act. Consulting amongst themselves, they came to an agreement. In effect, they would keep Beijing's declaration of war, which had been transmitted via telegraph, largely under wraps, in the hopes of maintaining stability in the provinces. That is, they were not going to take part in this war. Another member of government, a man named Shang Xuanhuai, who was the director of posts and telegraphs, went so far as to covertly notify foreigners and foreign consuls in Shanghai for their protection. They did not want this conflict to spread into their territories. In response, on July 14th, foreign troops captured the city of Tianjin, which brought the capital more or less into striking distance. And this sent shockwaves through the court in Beijing. At first, there was a contemplation of trying to bring the Boxer unrest under control, but then they pivoted. And the strategy, in essence, became to make this campaign more aggressive in an effort to bring the conflict to a decisive conclusion before foreign troops could reach the city. Attacks on foreign legations accelerated, all while Boxer forces, now in fact supported by other Qing soldiers, this very powerful force from Gansu who were loyal to the court, enjoyed unfettered access across the capital with the ability to attack and kill foreigners and Christian converts as will. And there was this enclave known as the foreign legations that became almost an armed citadel that was under attack and managed to maintain something of a perimeter, but was in great jeopardy if that perimeter was breached. Finally, on August 4th, 20,000 foreign troops, a foreign expeditionary force made up of soldiers from the United States and Britain and Japan and Russia and Germany and France and others, reached Chinese shores and set out on a march to the Chinese capital. Their goal was to rescue their foreign nationals and to destroy the Boxers. 10 days later, on August 14th, these forces reached Beijing. The scale of this expeditionary force really sent shivers up the spines of Qing officials. Disguising herself as a peasant woman, the Empress Dowager Cixi fled the city, taking the child emperor Pu Chun with her. The group reached the city of Taiyuan on September 10th, and then the city of Xi'an in sort of north-central China on October 26th. With the capital in ruins and the Boxer movement destroyed, Chinese leader Li Hongzhang, who had stayed behind, signed the Boxer Protocol, which brought this conflict to an end. 2 months later, on November 7th, Li himself died of natural causes. For Qing China, the repercussions of the Boxer uprising were severe. Foreign powers imposed a war indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, almost double the war indemnity of the Treaty of Shimonoseki after the Sino-Japanese War. This needed to be repaid in 39 years. This number, 450 million taels of silver, was chosen less that it was a calculation of how much the war cost, rather than for its symbolic value. 1 tael of silver for every subject of the Qing Empire. And this was just the beginning. Pro-Boxer Chinese officials had to be executed. The civil service examination had to be suspended for 5 years. Anti-foreign activity had to be cracked down without mercy, and the stationing of foreign troops in China had to be permitted on a permanent basis to allow these countries to protect their expatriate nationals. Japan and certain Western powers seized upon this provision in particular. In the aftermath of the Boxer uprising, Japan went on to station many thousands of troops in China, especially in the city of Tianjin, while Russian military forces virtually occupied Manchuria. The repercussions went even beyond this, however. In particular, the factors that are essential to keep in mind, especially as we move into the 20th century and into upcoming videos, are as follows. First, if Chinese popular nationalism had started to emerge at this point, this was really the cauldron of the spread and of the intensification of mass Chinese nationalism. Second, because you have these Russian occupation force and this Japanese occupation force now in the territories of China on an unprecedented scale, this is bringing that collision course that I mentioned in a previous video all that much closer to the destructive moment. And that moment is coming soon in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, which is going to be fought in China over control of Northeast Asia. And finally, this period of time will generate, perhaps more than any other moment in the history that we've discussed thus far, the emergence of Chinese revolutionary thought. That is to say, the emergence of those who are looking out on the crisis that has beset their country, their empire, and come to the conclusion that the Qing state cannot be reformed. It has to be overthrown. It has to be replaced. This, in essence, is the birthplace of great sort of Chinese nationalist thinkers and revolutionary thinkers like Sun Yat-sen. And that is a subject that we're going to come back to in a later video. I'll see you then.